Thursday of the 13th week in Ordinary Time.
A reading from the book of Genesis. God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son Isaac, your only one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him up as a burnt offering on a height that I will point out to you." Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him his son Isaac, and 2 of his servants as well. And with the wood that he had cut for the burnt offering, set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham got sight of the place from afar. Then he said to his servants, "Both of you stay here with the donkey, while the boy and I go on over yonder. We will worship and then come back to you." Thereupon Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 walked on together, Isaac spoke to his father Abraham. "Father," he said. "Yes, son," he replied. Isaac continued, "Here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" "Son," Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the sheep for the burnt offering." Then the 2 continued going forward. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he tied up his son Isaac and put him on top of the wood on the altar. Then he reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the Lord's messenger called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Do not lay your hand on the boy," said the messenger. "Do not do the least thing to him. I know now how devoted you are to God, since you did not withhold from me your own beloved son." As Abraham looked about, he spied a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the site Yahweh Yireh. Hence people now say, "On the mountain the Lord will see." Again the Lord's messenger called to Abraham from heaven and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you acted as you did in not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants shall take possession of the gates of their enemies, and in your descendants all the nations of the earth shall find blessing. All this because you obeyed my command." Abraham then returned to his servants, and they set out together for Beersheba, where Abraham made his home. The Word of the Lord.
The responsorial psalm. The response is, "I will walk in the presence of the Lord, in the land of the living." Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, because of your kindness, because of your truth. Why should the pagans say, "Where is their God?" I will walk in the presence of the Lord, in the land of the living. Our God is in heaven. Whatever he wills, he does. Their idols are silver and gold, the handiwork of men. I will walk in the presence of the Lord, in the land of the living. They have mouths but speak not. They have eyes but see not. They have ears but hear not. They have noses but smell not. I will walk in the presence of the Lord, in the land of the living. Their makers shall be like them, everyone who trusts in them. The house of Israel trusts in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. I will walk in the presence of the Lord, in the land of the living.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After entering a boat, Jesus made the crossing and came into his own town. And there people brought to him a paralytic lying on a stretcher. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Courage, child, your sins are forgiven." At that some of the scribes said to themselves, "This man is blaspheming." Jesus knew what they were thinking and said, "Why do you harbor evil thoughts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Rise and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He then said to the paralytic, "Rise, pick up your stretcher, and go home." He rose and went home. When the crowd saw this, they were struck with awe and glorified God who had given such authority to men. The Gospel of the Lord.
Thursday of the 13th week in Ordinary Time. The first reading comes from Genesis 22, 1b to 19. We Christians call this passage the sacrifice of Isaac. Jewish people call it the binding of Isaac. Whichever name is used, it talks about a trial that puts Abraham to the test. Abraham has been forced to send Ishmael off into the desert, and so he's left with one son. That's the only son that fulfills the promise that God had made to him, that he would have a numerous inheritance. Well, what does God ask of Abraham? To sacrifice that son to him. And he asks it in a way that Abraham can't even miss the significance. "Abraham, take your son Isaac, the one you love, your only son, and take him to the land of Moriah and sacrifice him to me." Your only son because he's already been forced to send Ishmael off, the one he loves. And we know that Abraham truly does love his son, because as they go up Mount Moriah, Abraham carries the knife and the fire, while Isaac carries the wood. It's not that Abraham is lazy. A child would harm himself with a knife or fire, and so Abraham withholds it from Isaac until they get to the top of the mountain. They travel for 3 days, and Abraham is ready to sacrifice Isaac. On the way up, Isaac says, "Where's the sacrifice?" And Abraham's response, "God will provide." Remember, in Hebrew, that's a bit ambiguous because it could be read, "God will provide," or it could be read, "God has already provided." If Abraham is saying, "God has already provided," he's referring to his son. If he's saying, "God will provide," he's referring to something else, that God will somehow make this work out. Before he sacrifices the child, a messenger of God stops him and says that God truly knows your faith now. Now we could easily ask, couldn't God have tested him some other way? But it seems that it's in suffering, in giving up what is dearest to us, that we learn what trust and love really mean. And did God need to do this? Didn't God know Abraham's faith? And the answer is yes, God knew, but Abraham didn't. It's only in the context of this test that Abraham is able to learn what faith and trust really mean. Well, God does provide. There's a ram that has caught its horns in a bush, and Abraham sacrifices that ram in place of his son. Notice this idea of substitution. The early church fathers will use this often with the idea that Jesus was the substitute for us, for our sinful nature. He took our place. Now, this story might have originally been a story about the end of human sacrifice. There are some details that would point in that direction, but it's clear the way the story is phrased in Genesis that the author intended this to be a story about faith, about a testing, about trusting in God when trust doesn't seem possible. And typically, Abraham builds an altar on this site. Now, according to tradition, this site is the very site where the temple would be built many centuries later. It's a very difficult tradition to uphold because there's no archaeological evidence, but there are people who hold this tradition to this very day. The Gospel is from Matthew 9, 1-8. And like with yesterday's Gospel, which was the Matthean version of a Markan story, remember yesterday we heard about the 2 demoniacs instead of the 1 demoniac who was possessed by Legion. Today we have a Matthean version of the story of the man who's on a stretcher. His friends bring him, doesn't mention the fact that he's lowered through the roof, and Jesus' first words to him, "Your sins are forgiven you." Jesus has come most of all to heal the brokenness of our heart. And when the Pharisees object to this, who can forgive sins? Only God. Jesus is exercising a prerogative that belongs to God alone. He says, which is easier, to forgive his sins or to heal him? Now, actually, what's easier is to heal him, because it's a lot easier to heal a broken leg than a broken heart. Jesus also heals him physically, and everybody's filled with amazement. As far as Jesus was concerned, this man was going to be carried away with his sins forgiven, with a big smile on his face, because that was the greater healing. Because the Pharisees demanded something else, he also healed him physically. And so when we approach God for a favor, we should recognize that the gift of healing, the gift of being loved by God, is the greatest gift we could ever receive. Everything else pales in light of that. And may God bless us.